Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. Azim Shariff. He is professor and Canada Research Chair at the University of British Columbia in Canada. And today we're talking about cultural differences in how people react to robots, AI, and so on, robot preachers, people's belief in free will, and the political ramifications of that, why people love rags to riches stories, causal attributions to poverty, the moralization of effort, and some other related topics. So, Dr. Sharif, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, it's great to be here, Ricardo. I was looking at all the interviews you've done in apparently the 5 years since we last talked, and you have built such an incredible corpus of interviews. I think you have probably had in-depth conversations with a wider range of interesting psychologists and social scientists than anyone on the planet, which is a hell of a thing, right? I mean, I can't think of somebody who's done more than that.
Well, I mean, I don't know, but I thank you very much for the kind words.
Well,
Well,
what it makes me think, here's what it makes me wonder. Um, you have these conversations on a weekly basis. You're talking to really interesting people. Uh, you must synthesize a lot of really interesting points. And I'd be curious about what the kind of synthesis you're making, what kind of summaries, what kind of connections you're making between all of these. Have you thought about doing some of your like producing something of your own, like maybe so a couple ways you could do this, and we'll get into talking about my research eventually, but
yeah.
uh, for one, you could cut interviews topically. So you bring, say you had a topic of cultural evolution, and you bring all the different cultural evolution people you've talked to, and like do little clips. Alternatively, you could produce some sort of like book or your own lectures that were based on bringing these insights together, and you could have little clips of many of the interviews. I mean, I think you probably have in your head right now uh, just an unrivaled amount of psychological knowledge.
Well, let's see if some AI tools in the near future will help me with that, because with the enormous amount of content I already have, just thinking about going to the hundreds of interviews and clipping them and then putting it
Yeah.
together, I mean, it's just a nightmare in my head. So hopefully AI will help here, so, in the near future. So, but thank you so much for the suggestions, by the way. And so, to get into the topics here today, yeah, I know. I mean, you study a broad range of topics, but let's get into some of the work you've done on how people react and deal with robots, algorithms, artificial intelligence, because it seems that there are cultural differences here, right?
Yeah. So one of the things that we see is that most of this research tends to be put out, and most of the discussion of this tends to be put out, as most things tend to be put out, by the United States. The United States, as well as Canada, where I live, tend to be outliers in terms of their fear of AI.
Right.
If you look across the world, other countries tend to be much more embracing of it. Um, and so I think a lot of the discourse is probably dominated by an unrepresentative fear of a global fear of AI that probably doesn't exist everywhere.
And so, but what are some of the cultural differences that you found, and what cultures did you study particularly?
Well, we've looked at it in a few different ways. I think the biggest differences, and maybe the most interesting differences, emerge between the West and East Asia.
Hmm.
And when I say the West, I mean, I guess I could say even more specifically North America and
Hmm.
East Asia.
Right.
You see, as I mentioned, the most fear and worry in the U.S. and Canada, and you see much less in East Asia. You see much more willingness to engage with social robots. You see much more willingness to engage with chatbot buddies. So a lot of the things which freak people out in the US seem to be just fine in places like Japan, China, Korea.
And why is it that we find these differences? I mean, where is it in the culture of people from East Asia that make them more receptive to these kinds of technologies than people in North America, for example?
Yeah, so this is work that was led by Yam Kai Chi. He goes by Sam, so I'll call him Sam. Um, we can only speculate about various reasons for this, but I think there are some interesting kind of foundational cultural differences, which then get exaggerated through a sort of positive feedback loop, right? So you have what could be a potentially pretty small cultural difference, which then leads to different levels of exposure, right? So
Yeah.
historically, so there's some religious differences, right? So in Buddhism and Shintoism, there's more of an embracing of animism, whereas
Yeah.
in, say, the Abrahamic religions, there's it's very centered on human exceptionalism, right? It's much more about separating humans from all the other creatures of the world and putting humans on this interesting pedestal. So that can lead to a bit of uh, a competition between humans and any other types of creatures, where other types of creatures, including, like, we here maybe in North America think about the Terminator as a anthropomorphic, quintessentially terrible robot. Whereas what you tend to see in terms of these social robots in East Asia are kind of like cuddly robotic seals and things like that, which um, they seem much more willing to embrace, potentially because of this connection, this willingness to embrace animism and a more animated world, to see agency among animals. Um,
Mhm.
Now, that could be a very small difference, which then leads to, as I mentioned, a few changes in terms of how fiction portrays these robots, the Terminator versus Astro Boy. And that could lead to then a difference in the exposure. So in Japan, you had social robots quite a bit earlier. People have been exposed to them. People who are, my age or your age now have grown up with them their whole lives, which means that they're much more comfortable with them entirely, and so that can kind of lead
Yeah.
to these positive feedback loops, which draws the cultures in different directions.
That's actually very interesting because I'm a big anime and manga fan and follower, and I mean, I've been following it for 10 plus years. And you see, even in these sort of artistic mediums, how people in Japan tend to be much more receptive to technological innovations, and how even sometimes they tend to think about them as just part even of the natural environment. I mean, it's something that humans create, but they look at them more in a more natural way than people in the West, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Um, there's a few other explanations, right? So in another
Yeah.
project, unpublished project right now, we've been looking at how fear of AI relates to people's belief about how well, uh, about the capacities for AI for replacing particular jobs, right? So
Yeah.
you can imagine that one of the jobs that I probably wouldn't want an AI to do, though there's some maybe exceptions to this, is being a judge, having the moral decision making.
Hmm.
And most people around the world have some hesitancy about AIs taking over the role of judges or of religious leaders or whatever. But it does vary between countries, and the variation between countries seems to be explained by a belief that, well, actually, the requirements of such a job are not outside of the requirement of the abilities of a particular AI or robot. And the more you see the AI able to fulfill those positions, the less you tend to fear AI. And so a big difference for this is in Japan versus in, say, the United States, care workers. Japan sees AIs or robots to be very capable of reaching the requirements of being a care worker, whereas in the United States, that's not the case. And that seems to correspond to the country's fear of AI as well. And there's another interesting, this is not my paper, this is Noah Costello, I think, did this really interesting study where he found that uh, people from more corrupt countries, countries with higher levels of corruption, uh, have less algorithm aversion. So they're less averse to algorithms making decisions for them rather than the humans themselves. And that makes sense if you think that, well, I trust humans because I trust them to be able to make complex moral decisions. But if I'm coming from a place where, well, those moral decisions tend to be made in very corrupt ways, then I'm potentially going to trust the algorithm that is more fair-minded or more objective in terms of its decisions, less willing to give into favoritism. Humans are flawed in that way. Maybe the algorithms wouldn't be. So you do see that cultural variation as well.
Well, I guess that in that case, people would prefer algorithms if they are not corrupt themselves.
That's right.
Otherwise,
That's right.
they probably would prefer to deal with other people, right?
That's right. So, and furthermore, the beneficiaries of corruption are probably going to prefer the humans or the corrupt algorithms above more fair-minded ones as well.
And so you mentioned something there that in regards to people who occupy certain positions, and something that you've done work on is about robot preachers. So what results did you get there, and what implications would it have to cultural evolutionary theories of religion?
Yeah, so this was another study that involved Sam and Josh Jackson. You should speak to Josh if you haven't already. I don't know if you have. Um, where we did a couple of experiments, field experiments. First one was in a Buddhist temple in Japan, where we looked at people who had visited. They have this interesting robot preacher called Mindar that exists in a pretty well-known old Buddhist temple,
Yeah.
which creates an interesting juxtaposition. And you have we looked at people who'd heard a sermon delivered by Mindar versus a human preacher.
Yeah.
And then we looked at how willing they were to donate to the temple and other measures of support for the religion or the temple. And then another study, and this was a more controlled experiment. This was in a temple in Singapore. We randomly assigned on, well, not randomly assigned. We had on different days we had a robot preacher appear or not.
Yeah.
So that was a more controlled experiment in terms of who got the humans and who got the preachers, and again measured things like willingness to donate, willingness to share flyers about the religion, to spread the word of the religion, etc. And what we found there, I probably won't surprise many, which is that when people engaged with a robot preacher, they showed less support. They were willing to give less to their temple. They were less willing to spread the word of the religion. It decreased their commitment to the religion, and the result I don't think is super surprising. But I think what's interesting is the theory that surrounds it. Right? Why is it that we would react differently in the context of religious leaders to robot preachers versus human preachers? And as we were thinking about this, one of the things that we talked about was that a lot of the discussion about what jobs robots and AI can take over and which ones they can't seem to be focused on the current capabilities of the robot. And what's interesting about that is that what we've seen over the last, I guess, 15 months is that the capabilities of AI are just expanding so rapidly that that's an ever shrinking a space of things, right? Even when you see the modern robots that they're able to engage in surprisingly nimble, fine motor patterns.
Yeah.
So in terms of capabilities, the jobs that AI don't have the capability to do are shrinking. But we were looking at a separate thing. Instead of looking at capability, we were looking at credibility. And I think this capability-credibility distinction is interesting because credibility depends on more than just your ability to improve the technology of AI. For credibility, it seems to rely on something about what the person who's passing on the information to you has experienced or is as a person. And so this digs into cultural evolutionary theories, dual inheritance theories, about the fact that when we get ideas or when we absorb rituals or different norms and practices, values, beliefs, morals, we do so not solely based on the content. It's not simply what the content of the ritual is that determines whether we accept it and to what degree. It also depends greatly on the context, and in particular, the person who's delivering it to us, the person who's telling us about the ritual, or trying to teach it to us, or trying to pass on the moral, pass on the sermon or whatever. And there are various things which increase the credibility of the person passing it on. Joe Henrich has talked about these in the context of credibility enhancing displays. There's various things which enhance the credibility. And the canonical example of what a credibility enhancing display is something that it would be very it would be costly to the model, the cultural model, if they didn't actually believe it. And so if a cultural model like an elder or something is trying to get you to eat a blue mushroom, and they eat the blue mushroom themselves, that's a very credibility enhancing display. Because if they didn't believe that mushroom was safe, they wouldn't eat it themselves. Now, in order to have this credibility, you have to have some sort of level of mind to actually believe in what you're doing, which AIs don't have as far as we know, and or some ability to suffer for the consequences. And again, as far as we know, AI don't yet suffer. And so without those abilities, without things that you see for among religious leaders, like say priests who are celibate for life, that's a pretty credibility enhancing display. They're going to a lot of expense to show that they are somebody who firmly believes in the religion. Those things aren't going to affect an AI. They're not going to be credibility enhancing if you say, oh well, this preacher's never had sex in their life. It's like, well, that doesn't tell me much about them.
No, that's very interesting. And by the way, just out of curiosity, these robot preachers, I mean, can they perform a mass?
Well, yeah, so they can now. It's not as charismatic and elegant and even fluid as a human would do. But the point about the capabilities is, well, that's a gap that can be easily closed. So at some point, possibly soon, they will be able to do it as charismatically and fluidly as a human. But that credibility gap probably won't be closed. And you can see that not just for robot preachers, but you can see that in other professions where credibility matters as well. And so one that I think about a lot and I find really interesting, my wife is a psychiatrist. And so in the realm of therapy, there has been a lot of progress with therapy chatbots because they can rapidly or massively expand they reduce the cost and massively expand the number of people who can have access to therapy. And for some reasons, for some functions, they've been shown to be very effective. But what they don't have is the credibility, and that might be a limiting factor for how effective they can actually be. Ricardo, have you seen Good Will Hunting?
Yes.
Yes, I think most people have seen Good Will Hunting. Hopefully most of your audience has seen Good Will Hunting. But one of the interesting things about that is you have the Matt Damon character, who's incredibly capable, right? This disturbed genius. And then you have the Robin Williams character, the therapist, who is not as smart as Matt Damon, right? Like Matt Damon goes through all these therapists because he can outsmart them, and he's much more capable than they are at any intellectual feat. And eventually what you see is that, well, the Robin Williams character has this credibility. He has this credibility because he has this depth of feeling, he has this experience of being in the war and then having his wife die of cancer, and he's this deep feeler. And that credibility is what ultimately gets to Matt Damon and ends up helping him.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And I guess that in the case of chatbots who help with mental health, perhaps two benefits that they would have in comparison to human psychotherapists or someone like that is that they would have more readily access to a bigger amount of data from the patient and also better memory. I guess, in terms of what the
Yeah,
patient said and all of that.
that's right. That's right. And there's a third benefit, which is that they're not human, which means that they don't come with all the judgment or the perceived judgment that a human
Mhm.
comes with. So people might be more willing to admit things or talk about things with a non-human chatbot than they would with an actual human therapist, as empathetic and a good listener as they are.
So let's get into another topic now. Where do people's belief or lack thereof in free will comes from?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, one answer to that question would be uh, uh, philosophy, right? So it could,
Mhm.
there's this saying that behind every living person, there's a dead philosopher. And what they mean by that is that, it's not that, everybody's read David Hume or whatever, but those ideas do penetrate the culture and affect us. And so ideas that philosophers from days of yore have bestowed upon our culture have affected us growing up. So that's one explanation. Another explanation is that there's something um, just intuitive about it, that our brains are constructed in a way which has us believe in free will. Um, but another explanation is that there's situational factors that determine when and in what contexts and for whom we believe in free will, and this can be kind of flexibly allocated. And I take from your question that you're pushing me towards the research that we've done on these flexible
Yeah.
free will beliefs,
Mhm.
which I find I think it's a really interesting body of research. This is led by Corey Clark, who I think you have spoken with.
Mhm.
Uh, and for her, so behind that living person, the dead philosopher, is Nietzsche, who said, who pointed out, among the various forms of morality that he didn't like, he said this reprehensible idea of free will that people flexibly deploy when they want to punish somebody. That we use it as a justification. We say
Mhm.
that that person has free will because I want to punish them for what they did, and and in order to do so, I need to be able to hold them responsible. I need it to be their fault, and for it to be their fault, they have to have been able to have done otherwise, which means they have to have free will.
Mhm.
And so, in the work that I've done with Corey and others, uh, we find that in all these different circumstances, when we make it such that people really want to punish that other person, they
Mhm.
raise their level of free will belief. So one of the best studies of this in the first package we did on this was Corey was teaching two classes, two sections of a class. Actually, I don't know if it
Uh-huh.
was Corey was teaching, but anyway, somebody was teaching two
Yeah.
sections of a class. And in one of them, she said that there was a cheater on the last midterm.
Mhm.
Uh, and so riled up everybody's, oh no, that person's screwing us all over. And in the other condition, the other section, she didn't say that. And then she had all of them do a free will scale. And in the case where people were told that there was a cheater, where people had this sense, this desire to punish somebody, to enforce the retribution for moral wrongness, well, in that case, they believed in free will more. And there's a bunch of more controlled vignette studies which show that.
But apart from these more situational aspects of whether you want to punish someone or not, are there individual differences in the degree to which people believe in free will?
There, there's some personality correlates.
Uh-huh.
So people higher in, I think, openness and extroversion believe in free will more.
Mhm.
Uh, I think there's no relationship with IQ or anything like that. Um, you do find, and this potentially this causal direction goes in the opposite direction. People who are happier, who have higher life satisfaction, tend to believe in free will more. It might be that people who believe in free will more, as a consequence, are
Right.
happier. Um, One of the more interesting and very reliable group differences that we find is that conservatives tend to believe in free will more than do liberals.
Oh.
And that sort of fits with some of our stereotypes about what liberals and conservatives believe, right? Conservatives tend to be all about the individual picking themselves up by their own bootstraps. Everybody's accountable, responsible, go clean your room, etc. Whereas liberals are like, oh no, everything was systemic. Nothing is any individuals doing. It's all because of the structures that surround us. So liberals tend to believe in free will less, and that comes up over and over again. When those studies tend to be done, they tend to use this. Well, you find it with a variety of free will measures. It tends to be in these very philosophical free will measures that are measuring people's philosophical commitments to free will. But oftentimes when people read those, they think about it in the political sphere. So they think about it on constraints of freedom. So that kind of that liberal conservative difference that we were talking about the systemic versus individual accountability thing.
And when it comes to that more political side of things, do people who believe in free will, and I guess that in this particular case it would be more conservatives than liberals, support economic inequality more? Is there any relationship there?
Yeah, so conservatives tend to have more tolerance for economic inequality than liberals do.
Yeah.
As you know. Interestingly, though, we have an interesting paper that looks at, again, unpublished, that shows that when you look at liberals and conservatives' economic preferences, if you look at economic preferences for different ways that you could slice up the pie or grow the pie, or different goals that you have, alleviating poverty versus, say, reducing inequality versus just growing the amount of wealth for everybody, both liberals and conservatives, by far, their primary goal is to alleviate poverty, but they don't think that about each other. So liberals think that what conservatives are really after is just growing the pie and increasing the amount of money for the rich. Yeah. And conservatives think that liberals just want to reduce inequality, when in reality, both groups really just want to alleviate poverty. But where you were going with that was that do we find that people with different that free will beliefs actually seem to affect support for inequality? We tested that. We tried to test that in a few different ways, and we never found overwhelming support for that. So we did publish a paper reporting our null results for that. So I have no evidence to support that that's the case.
By the way, do you think that studying free will or belief in free will through a psychological perspective and really having this understanding that the degree to which people believe in free will varies according to the situation and their own perhaps individual characteristics, do you think it has any bearing on the free will debate and whether free will itself is real or not at all?
No, not really.
No.
Free will either exists or it doesn't, and it's. I mean, I don't think the beliefs, all these like psychological consequences of beliefs reflect on it in the same way that I think for religion, right? You know, religion and morality is a big topic of research for mine. Whether religion causes people to be more moral or not doesn't really have any bearing on whether God exists.
Mm-hmm. No, but that's an interesting question, because there are many people who pick on these studies and this kind of knowledge to say, oh, you see, it's just people just attribute free will to other people when they want, and when they don't do it, and so free will doesn't exist at all. I mean, just to support a deterministic stance, let's say.
Yeah, I think they're reasonably independent. Your belief about free will and the actual existence of free will, where I guess you could have some. Okay, let's think about this. So, I'm extrapolating now from the example of religion. So, one of the things where the psychological research on religion would probably have a bearing on whether God exists is that it can produce alternative explanations for why we believe in God. So, in that sense, it gives you. The belief in God could be overdetermined, and I guess free will belief could also be overdetermined. It could exist, and we could believe it, and we could believe it for reasons that are unrelated to why it exists. Yeah, I don't know. My sense is that they're pretty independent. Yeah.
So, and since we were just on the topic of politics, another thing that you've studied and I wanted to ask you about is, when it comes to voting behavior and supporting specific political candidates or leaders, do people always follow their own self-interest? Because that's something that we hear a lot, that's what people do. So
Yeah. So I guess it depends what you mean by the self.
mm.
People can expand. You know what? Before we tackle that, I just want to mention one more thing about the free will and politics thing,
Oh,
because
okay,
uh,
okay.
we did this very big paper with Jim Everett, looking at uh, the two things about free will that we talked about, right? So we talked about this flexible deployment of free will attributions when people want to punish somebody, and we talked then about the politics. We combined both of those into that paper to show that one of the one of the a driving factor, which is, I think, what we say in the paper. But what the paper actually showed is one of the primary factors about why those differences in free will beliefs exist between liberals and conservatives is
Mhm.
because, in general, conservatives tend to moralize a broader array of things and thus want to punish more things. And as a result, simply because they want to punish more things, they want to hold people more accountable for all these different moral transgressions. They ramp up their belief in free will in order to justify doing that. And we demonstrate this in a few different ways, but one of, I think, the most interesting is that when you look at topics that liberals and conservatives moralize to the same degree, they don't differ in terms of their free will beliefs about that.
Mm.
And for topics that liberals actually moralize to a greater degree, uh, then liberals will now believe in free will more for those types of things. And so again, it gets to that flexibility that yes, it's the case that by and large conservatives believe in free will more, but when it's inconvenient for them to do so, and when it's convenient for liberals to do so, they will flip.
Okay. No, that's very interesting. And so just going back to the self-interest aspect here. So I mean, do people actually in their voting behavior and support for political candidates always follow their self-interest or not?
No, so um, it seems that people's group identities matter a lot to them, and
Yeah.
oftentimes they will vote against their obvious individualistic economic self-interests, say,
Mm.
in order to maintain their loyalty to the group or to make sure that their particular cultural interests, broader cultural interests, win out over a competing group. Um, so um, uh, when when so I guess this would argue against that famous James Carville point that it's the economy stupid, that people always vote with their pocketbooks, and to some degree they do. But we ran a study, um, Steve Rathje and Simone Chenal, um, on uh, on Trump voters who had disappointing tax returns. And we ran a longitudinal study which said, what do you expect to get for your tax return? And because this was when there were some changes in the tax record. I'm trying to remember what happened. There were all these crazy things that happened during
Yeah.
those years. And one of the things was like a rejiggering of the state taxes and the federal taxes such that people's tax returns were going to change, and their predictions were going to be off. And so we looked at Trump voters and asked, how important are your taxes to whom you vote for? And what do you expect for your taxes? And then we followed them up. And for those people who had disappointing tax records, we asked, well, will you still vote for Trump for re-election? They said yes. And then we asked, well, how much do your taxes matter to your voting? And they said, well, now much less. So they downgraded how important that factor was, because that factor wasn't really what was driving their voting intentions. They just kind of thought that maybe it is. Maybe I'm going to care about things which affect me, but really they're larger group political commitments. I'm trying not to use the word trumped their other concerns, so overrode their other concerns. And when we published that, it took us a little while to publish it. And by the time we did, Trump was out of office, and Biden was in. And we were like, okay, well, I guess this will be a nice historical record. It's not going to be that relevant anymore. But of course, now it seems like there's a really competitive election going on, and it might be relevant
Yeah.
all over.
So, I mean, there are many different follow-up questions that interesting follow-up questions that I could ask here, but with our time limit in mind, let me just ask you one. So, does it make any sense to think that perhaps since a political candidate usually proposes several different kinds of policies and not just one, that let's say, even if people are voting against their own self-interest when it comes to, for example, taxation, they would be voting for their own self-interest when it comes to, for example, immigration, if that's
Mhm.
something that they care more about. I mean,
Right.
does that make sense or?
Yeah, that does make sense. Though I suspect there you also have the group commitments. So, for instance, if an individual was going to be negatively, let's say an individual was going to be positively affected by immigration, or
Mhm,
they were personally going to be positively affected by uh, a restriction, and I don't know how that's going to work. So, let's say a liberalizing of abortion laws.
mhm,
Um, uh, I think that if their group was going against that. So if it differentially affected them versus their group, and they were very fused with their group, they had a lot of their identity tied in with the group, they would still go against the immigration policy or the abortion policy that favored themselves the most in order to stand by their group.
mhm. So, sort of related to economics here, why do people tend to like rags to riches stories? And I mean, do people tend to have more positive views of those who become rich than those who are born rich or not?
Yeah, so I'm interested in I'm interested in whether where you are, Poland, right? It's Poland? Where are you?
No, Portugal, Portugal.
Portugal. You're in Portugal. Why have
Yeah.
I thought Poland this whole time? Well, I'd be more interested in what people in Poland would say, but I'm also interested in what people in Portugal think. In the U.S., this is a really big thing. The rags to riches
Yeah.
stories are part of the American mythos, and I've been marinated in the American Canadian culture since I was born, and so to me, it seems like well, uh, people love these stories because they show that it's possible and it shows that it's earned. And so people really want to think that both of those things are true. It's system
Mhm,
justifying to believe that we live in a place where we're not restricted by our accidents of birth.
mhm,
Um, and so what you tend to see uh, in North America, we measured it in the United States that yes, people much prefer those who've become rich to those who are born rich, and we have many examples in the U.S. of these great stories of the Oprah Winfrey and all these people. Bill Clinton's another good example. And when
mhm,
these happen, which they occasionally do because it's a big country, people will like shout it from the rooftops because they really want to believe that's possible. Um, I was I'll tell you a little story. So I
mhm,
was Thanksgiving dinner, no, 4th of July. I was living in the U.S. I was actually in on vacation with my girlfriend at the time with a bunch of her friends. 4th of July, we were in Mexico and we were having dinner. And there's this really cheesy thing that they did. I guess these people really liked America, and they said, "Let's go around the table and everybody say what they love about America." And there were these two guys who were there, both of whom were like they were finance bros, but they had very different backgrounds.
yeah,
So one came from money,
mhm,
and um, had done everything he could to lose it. He'd been like a beach bum and whatever, and he could not. He was just destined to stay rich. And the other guy was the exact opposite. So he clawed his way up from poverty. He was a poor student, remedial student, and he just like worked his ass off to become rich. And we were going around the table, and it first came to that guy, the guy who had become rich. Um, and he said, "Well, the great thing about America is that anybody can make it here if you just work hard enough. If you just work hard enough, anybody can become rich. They can succeed like I have." I don't know if he said like I have. Uh, and then it went to the next guy, and he's just the rich guy who's always been rich, and he was just staring at him and goes, "No, they can't. I've looked at the data. People who are born rich, and people who are born poor stay poor on average. And
Mhm.
his experiences suggested that. Um, and so those two different perspectives are very interesting. Um, what what you what we find is that, like I said, people tend to like the became rich people better. What's interesting is they also think that the became rich people, the people who had clawed their way up from poverty, will be more sympathetic to and supportive of the plight of the poor,
Mhm.
because they they have a totally reasonable conclusion that those people have been there. They have more sympathy. The rich people, the Rockefellers, whatever, they're out of touch. They don't know what it's like to be poor. Why would they want to help the poor? And what we find in reality is the opposite. Even though people perceive that things are going to be like that way, in reality, the people who are born rich tend to be more supportive of the poor, more sympathetic to the plight of the poor, more willing to engage in redistribution than the people who became rich. And the explanation we find is that for those people who've clawed their way up, they
Yeah.
believe that it is possible for everybody because they've done it themselves. And if they believe that it's possible for everybody, they hold other people accountable for it not having happened for them. Well, if it hasn't happened for them, it's because they didn't try hard enough. I tried hard enough and it happened for me. Whereas the people like the rich surfer guy, he's like, you know what? I tried to lose money and I couldn't. And people down there probably tried to make money and they couldn't. So it's not because of their individual abilities or efforts or merit. It's because these are structural things.
You know where you see that a lot, where people who become rich are really against, I don't know, poverty alleviation or more taxation or something like that among immigrants who succeeded. I mean, immigrants who succeeded, no one from their original country likes them because they are just annoying. They
Yeah.
think that anyone can do it, and if you don't have it, it's because you don't work hard enough or something like that. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very important to pay attention to the headwinds and the tailwinds that affect people and how they got where they are.
Yeah. And so, does this relate in any way to support for social welfare? I mean, is it that people who became rich also tend to support social welfare less than the ones who were born rich?
You know what? I'm not sure about that. I think we saw some evidence for that, and we mentioned it in the paper that we wrote. Certainly, you can think of examples, but of course, these are cherry-picked examples, right? You think of
Yeah.
the Roosevelts, right? The Roosevelts came from a very, very wealthy family, landowning New York family,
Yeah.
and they were some of the more progressive presidents. Um, but I think you could probably come up with counterexamples of that pretty easily. So let's not quote me on any of that. The data
Yeah.
are out there. I just can't remember what they say.
And so, when it comes to causal attributions for poverty, do they relate to attitudes toward inequality? And by the way, what tend to be the more common causal attributions here
For
for
for poverty or
poverty? Yeah, no, for
for
poverty.
poverty.
For poverty. Yeah,
Yeah. So in America, people tend to believe, more so than I would have suspected. They tend to believe that the poor are responsible for being poor,
yeah,
um, which is interesting because they're often given a lot of evidence to the contrary.
yeah.
Maybe that's just in the media that I'm exposed to, but they believe that more than other places, and they believe that more than I would have suspected in
Mhm.
the U.S. By the way, in Korea, this is just some new data that the lead author on that, former student of mine, Hyun-Jin Koo, collected. She found that in South Korea, uh, people also have this preference for the no. People also believe that the became rich would be more sympathetic to the poor. But unlike in America, where people prefer to be the became rich, in South Korea, people prefer to be the born rich. And she suspects, and this is what she's measuring currently, is that that's due to a sense of social class fatalism. So in Korea, they have this metaphor of being born with either a golden spoon or a clay spoon. And so you're a gold spoon or a clay spoon type of person. And people want to be the people who are born with the gold spoon because that stays with you regardless of whether your economics changes. You're a gold spoon person or a clay spoon person. And I think one of the things that the American ethos is about is that, well, nobody is essentially their class. That America is a place which doesn't have those essential characteristics, and you don't have to be a clay spoon your whole life if you were born that way.
So, I mean, if people tend to believe that people who are poor, it's because of their own, it's their own fault, it's because of the bad decisions they made, they also tend to be more accepting of inequality in their society, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, so we see that across countries. So places where there's a greater belief in um, uh, where there's a greater belief in social mobility, there's a greater tolerance for inequality.
Inequality. Yeah.
And in fact, that's a greater predictor of the level of inequality of the support for inequality than the level of inequality in that country itself. So when people believe that you're able to get out of your position, they're going to be less willing to help you for not having done it.
So to get into the last topic, what is the moralization of effort? I mean, what is it really about, and what do these plays of effort signal socially to other people?
Yeah, so this is work. I want to keep giving credit to all the first authors and students on this. So this is work by that was led by Jared Selnicker. It's based on some other work as well by various researchers. But basically, what we found there is that even for people who don't produce more than somebody else, somebody who's putting a lot of effort into their behaviors, whether it's at work, whether it's in their hobbies, they're seen as a more moral person. So if you see the actual anecdote I give about this is that one of the co-authors on the paper, Paul Piff, he's a good friend of mine, and he's a runner. He runs in the morning. He's a jogger. He's a jogger. Let's be real. And he when I met him, I moved to, this is when I was at UC Irvine. He was at UC Irvine, and I kept hearing that he would go on these jogs, and I find people who jog kind of annoying because they're all like holier than thou and whatever. But then one day I saw him jogging, and I expected when he was jogging he'd just be like, you know, like smiling at the beautiful Californian sun and just like taking it easy and just being in like, you know, this Mr. Perfect kind of guy. Yeah. But he was like hobbling over. He was like, one leg wasn't working, and it was dripping in sweat, and he had this look of just agony on his face. And it made me have that much more respect for him because he was putting in that much more effort to, you know, a task which didn't really help anybody. It was just for him. It has no bearing on harming or helping anybody else, but it did make him seem like a more moral person for some reason. And so the theory behind it is that we are constantly trying to figure out amongst the market for people who is going to be a good cooperator, who's going to be a good moral person. We want to surround ourselves with people who are dependable, trustworthy, moral people. And so we're looking for any cue that actually would suggest that somebody is like that somebody would be a good cooperation partner. And effort is a really good one. So effort tells you whether, if you needed help, if you needed somebody to actually do something for you, that's somebody who's willing to invest effort into things. Yeah. And in a way, potentially, we don't have evidence for this, but in a way, you could imagine that the people who are willing to invest effort into the most meaningless things are the people who are even that much more trustworthy, because they would put in effort to whatever you needed them for, not just things which have economic benefits. And so we showed in a number of different studies that, yeah, so people who are shown, so like if you have two widget makers and they produce the same amount of widgets, the one for whom it's hard, who works really hard, that person's seen as more moral, and you'd want them as a partner, you'd want them as a trust partner, more than the person who it comes easily to.
Do you like soccer?
I don't like soccer. I mean, I have nothing against soccer, but
No. But I'm mentioning that because one very famous example of how people look at effort and how they moralize it is the debate between who's the best soccer player ever, Cristiano Ronaldo or Messi. Because since Cristiano Ronaldo is always on social media advertising his work ethic, many people out there tend to think that he is the best soccer player ever because he puts in more effort than Messi, which, by the way, is wrong because Messi has also improved his play through the years, so he trains a lot. But anyway, that's just an example.
No, I mean, another good example of this is in basketball with Kobe Bryant and Shaquille O'Neal.
Yes.
Because Shaq was born with these amazing natural gifts, and Kobe was like the hardest working person in the NBA. And you really, if I were to try to pick somebody who's, I mean, I guess Kobe had those sexual assault allegations, but you know, he seemed, I guess the work ethic does make him seem like a more moral person. Yeah, and I think there's probably many examples of that, and I think we do venerate people who are seen as hardworking. And I was thinking, even some of these memes or these trends that take off on social media. I was thinking about this cold plunge thing. You know, these people who like wake up in the morning, they jump in a bunch of ice cubes. I don't know if that helps people, but I imagine that people venerate the people who go through that simply because it's like a grit your teeth and bear. It's hard to do, and it seems to just have this automatic, I respect that person, I think that person's good because they're doing this really hard thing. I think we tend to do that. I think we tend to think of people who are just willing to put in a lot of effort for things. We see them as very moral. There's an interesting paper in behavioral brain science. Leo Fatucci was I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I hope that's right. Was the lead author on it, which was looking at this idea of a Puritan moralizing. That their argument was that the reason why people moralize these things which tend not to have victims or beneficiaries, like eating too much or drinking, gambling, all these kinds of things. Their argument was that, well, those things lead people to have less self-control. But I think that's insightful. But I think a small tweak on that is that those things signal who has high self-control and who doesn't. And so if you see somebody who's engaging in eating too much or is giving into gambling too much or whatever, that's a signal to you that, well, if you really needed them, you don't know that they'll be able to come through because they indulge. They don't have the self-control to rein in their behavior when they really need to. And so I gave a talk. I gave a talk on this effort moralization thing. It was up on YouTube, and of course I made the mistake of reading the comments, which were generally positive. But then one comment, which I can't forget, was like talking about all this effort important for self-control. You should know that self-control is also relating to hair grooming, bro. It was like accusing me of being unkempt, which I guess I am. And it made me realize that even those types of cues, right? Like clean shaven, well-kempt, well-groomed people, that's another demonstration of fastidiousness, discipline, self-control, I guess, hard work. I guess it's hard to stay well-groomed. All these cues, we're constantly surveying the social landscape to find these cues of who's going to be a dependable partner. And then we moralize everything that is such a cue.
Well, perhaps that would be another reason why so many people nowadays advertise on social media they're going to the gym, I guess.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's right. It's a great example of effort moralization. It doesn't help anybody. I guess it maybe eases some pressure on the healthcare system. But uh, yeah, I don't know. I think people respect people who do that more, for better or worse.
But when it comes to the more rational aspects of this, I mean, is it actually rational to value effort for effort's sake, even if it is sometimes unproductive, or at least doesn't help reaching the goals that we have in mind?
Well, it depends on what you mean by those goals, right? So I think that if I think that we are constantly, whether we like to think of it or not, because it seems inauthentic, but we are
Yeah.
constantly trying to send out signals to other people, to show that we're the type of people that we want to be wanted or something like that, or are desired as good cooperation partners. Even to our own friends and partners, we want to show commitment, trustworthiness, all these kinds of things. And so when we engage in this seemingly, at least economically unproductive effort, it is productive in this other sphere. It is productive for signaling to other people that we are reliable partners, which I think is an important thing to do. I think so. In that sense, it does have, whether this is the reason that we do it consciously or not, it does have that
Mhm.
sort of deep rationality to it. Um, yeah, I think one of the problems comes when it pops up in contexts which are then removed from that signal, right? So because we
Mhm.
venerate hard work so much, we now construct an entire labor system that rewards hard work, uh, even when it's economically unproductive, um, and it's not serving that interpersonal process. So if a boss is, if we're trying to show that we are the hardest working person in the office,
Yeah.
uh, when that doesn't accomplish the interpersonal benefits and it doesn't accomplish the economic goals of the company, then it's just draining people's time that could be spent doing
Mhm.
other things.
And so, just one last question. Does this phenomenon of moralization of effort connect in any way to support for social welfare?
So that's a good question. That's a project that Jared, the lead author, has
Mhm.
wanted to do. We haven't gotten to it yet. Um, right now, you see examples of that all the time, that people uh, are reticent to give social welfare when it's not connected to work, even if the work doesn't produce anything. People want to see people work. They get turned off by people not working because they perceive it as laziness, which makes you not respect the person, not like the person, not think of the person as moral, not think of the person as deserving. And as a result,
Yeah.
probably you're less willing to extend social welfare to them. So again, back to those attributions that we talked about earlier, those really matter because those determine what you feel about the people to whom you would be either donating money to or giving taxes for.
And I would imagine, I mean, this just came to my mind that in the case, for example, of homeless people, then there would be many social signals in their case that would signal to people that they are not putting in the effort because they are on the street, they are probably not working, they are not groomed.
Yeah,
Again, that bit
all,
from a few minutes ago. So,
all of that. Yeah, and similarly, they might have here in Vancouver a lot of drug addiction
yeah,
problems, so they have that cue as well.
yeah,
So all those things which people might attribute to just being low quality social partners,
yeah.
even if that person's not going to be a social partner to you. So that's a good example of a misfiring, right? Because you
Mhm,
then make all these attributions to the person. You don't like them. You see them as immoral uh, because they would be a bad social partner, but you
mhm.
aren't evaluating them to be a social partner. You're evaluating them as to whether they're going to be the recipient of help.
Mhm. Perhaps that's also our evolved psychology misfiring in our huge societies where we no longer interact just with 150 people, where we know everyone around, right?
Yeah, that's right. I've written a couple papers on this idea that um, the environmental change that we've undergone in the last 20 years, moving
Yeah,
from kind of the real world to a world that's more like this,
yeah,
where we look at screens, we interact with many, many strangers. millions of people, that environmental change from the real world to a virtual world to an online world is probably bigger than the environmental change that we went through 10, 12,000 years ago when we moved from being nomadic people to sedentary city dwellers. That was a big change. It had all these cultural evolutionary consequences. This one might be actually bigger and happening way faster.
Great. So let's wrap up the interview here, Dr. Shariff. And would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Oh, good question. Google Scholar. You can find my work there. Google Scholar. I'm also on Twitter at Azim Shariff. Yeah. Oh, and I have a website, but I don't really update it very much. That's shariflab.com. Really, Google Scholar, ResearchGate are probably the places you can get the papers.
Yeah, and of course, I will also leave the link to our first interview in the description of this one. So thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, great to see you again. Take care.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.